the conceptual encyclopedia in very aesthetic, personally motivated ways. Well, one of the things that really caught my imagination was the image that Coleridge used for the underground rivers, which are very much a very important part of the setting of Xanadu. And really the part that my particular region contributed was this image of the springs, the underground river, and the image that Coleridge uses to give you an idea about what's happening here, because what happens in Florida is you've got the underground river, it'll go underground. Actually, it's very frightening, the sites. If you go to the site, the Santa Fe River, where it goes underground, I mean, it's scary. If you have any fear of water in any way, I mean, this is really a nightmare, because suddenly this river is sucked underground, right down this hole, and this big river flowing in there, and then down it goes. And actually, there are cases where, the current gets swift. There have been like school kids and dogs and stuff that just get sucked down that river, sucked down that hole, and never found again, or like years later, their body surfaces because the water goes down into the aquifer and into this complete honeycomb of caverns and things under there. It's a very terrifying thought. But anyway, so the image of then it comes spurting up again at another site, and at a rate of some millions of gallons a minute or something, huge, force of underground wells, underground springs coming up, and the image that Coleridge uses to say what happens is this, where he's looking, he's reading Bartram, and Bartram is looking at a site here in Alachua County where the spring is coming up out of the ground, is boiling up out of the ground, and even tearing away, bits, anything that's in his path or something. And the image that Coleridge gives of that is of threshing, like winnowing, so it's like this image of a force of winnowing in which the wheat and the chaff are separated, and and so he gives this image of the water springing up as this image of winnowing. Well, again, I was just stunned as I read that image, because this winnowing image is an extremely important image. Coleridge is very learned. I mean, he was a scholar. Really, it was probably part of his problem as a poet was the extent of scholarship that he engaged in. Really a philosopher as much as a poet. So the question is, as a scholar, one wonders how much did he know, what had he read, and so on. But the thing is that the winnowing image is a key image in Plato's Timaeus. Plato's Timaeus is, probably of the dialogues, this is one of the most influential dialogues. It's the dialogue in which Plato sets forth his cosmology. It's the dialogue in which Plato tells the story of Atlantis. I mean, this was the first reporting that we have of Solon, coming back from Egypt is the way Plato tells it, and telling the Greeks the story of their own history, which they'd forgotten or which had been wiped out by the cataclysm. So there was the story of Atlantis was there in the Timaeus, and but in terms of metaphysics, in terms of theory, what happens in the Timaeus is Plato is working, this is the beginnings of literacy. And he's just figuring out concept formation. He had the idea of the forms, which everyone is familiar with, but the forms really are ideas, they're concepts, they're abstract categories. And so he's just trying to figure out how it works. He says, all right, there's being, which is, these ideas, it's these pure forms, these abstractions like the essence of justice. What is justice? There's some abstract, pure, perfect justice. But then there's becoming, which is the way in which in the world things rise and fall, people are born and die, seasons come and go, materials change and decay and so forth, and that's the world of becoming. And what puzzled Plato at the very beginnings of literacy is he's trying to figure out, well, how do being and becoming get together? Because one is pure and abstract and the other is material and changes and dies. How do they get together, theoretically? And so he couldn't figure it out. So he decided he needed a third kind, another dimension, which he called space, using the term chora. From Greek, had several choices of words there he could have used. He used the term chora, which was a particularly kind of sacred space. But anyway, so he said, well, there's a third thing, chora, which is neither being, meaning conceptual, something intelligible, nor becoming, which is perceptible. It's not intelligible, it's not perceptible, but it's the space, or he called it a receptacle, in which being and becoming get together. And it's in this receptacle that they interact in the receptacle or in space. And that's how being gets into becoming. That's how ideas get into things. But since it was neither. It was a theory. He's just figuring out theory. He invents. Plato is credited with inventing philosophy. He said, well, all right, it's not intelligible, it's not perceptible. How do you understand it? Like, how do you find out about Korah? How do you talk about it? How do you theorize about it? And he said, well, you have to. He's reluctant, but he said you have to fall back upon myth. You have to fall back upon metaphor. He called bastardized reason. Which is still, he's trying to escape from the Homeric epic. He's trying to escape from myth. He's inventing science. He founds the academy, the first school. He invents method in the Phaedrus. And so, all right, so he falls back on this sort of more aesthetic or mythological thing. So he had to use metaphors and images. And the image that he gave, so what's Korah like? Well, what happens at the site where being and becoming get together? And he said, well, there's something before, there's chaos before, and then after there's order. And Korah is where chaos passes into order. And he said, what it's like is, it's like threshing, it's like winnowing. It's like a winnowing basket where, you shake it around, and Korah is shaking around this, the receptacle is shaking and shaking, and it's chaos. And in the shaking, it sorts out, like the wheat and the chaff, it sorts things out into their kinds, and their basic four elements are earth, air, fire, and water. And this is in the Greek cosmology. So earth, air, fire, and water are sorted out in Korah. These are also geometric ratios. This is a Pythagorean theory of the harmony of the spheres, music of the spheres. And his whole cosmology is structured around this image. There were other metaphors that he gave. He gave the metaphor of the nurse, and it's like, well, Korah is kind of like the nurse, and being is like the father, and becoming is like the child, and then the nurse, or he didn't even call it the mother, but Korah was the nurse that took care of the child. Another really interesting metaphor for us was in terms of the body, because part of his cosmology was a cosmology of correspondences. So, so that there was the cosmos and the city and the individual were all lined up. As the saying of correspondence theory is, as above, so below. As it is in the stars, as it is in the cosmos, so it is in the individual, so it is in the community. And of course, when things aren't going right in the community or in the individuals, because they're out of whack, they're out of harmony. And that theory gave rise to alchemical psychology, the temperament theory, of black bile, phlegm, blood, and so on, and the whole theory of tempers, and the way you diagnose people's problems was, through the balance of the tempers in their body. So this correspondence, body, city, cosmos. But so the most important image was the image of winnowing. Well, that was the image that Coleridge used in Kubla Khan, for Xanadu. So this huge connection there came up. And what else was I going to say about that? Well, maybe that's a good dive point, yeah.